So a research field in which I have been quite active myself as a researcher is the field of bilingualism. And sometimes people ask me, well, why would you study bilingualism at all? Why is it interesting at all? Well, if you're interested in learning something about language and communication, maybe you should start by actually studying bilinguals, because actually more than half of the people in the world speak more than one language. And with bilinguals, typically in this type of research, we don't only mean people who grew up with two languages, for instance, because one parent spoke a certain one language and the other parent spoke a different language, but also if you started learning a second language in secondary school, for instance, people like you, most people like you and me, we also call them bilinguals because to some extent they master more than one language, they master two languages or even more, multilinguals. So you could say bilingualism or multilingualism is actually the norm. If you want to learn something about language and communication and its speakers, maybe start by studying bilinguals and not studying monolinguals, because actually monolinguals are the exception. There are also some nice practical advantages to bilingualism. So some research is showing that actually if you're a bilingual and you use your two languages throughout your life, often switching from one language to the other, this sort of keeps your brain in a good shape, perhaps even to such an extent that it might postpone the onset of dementia with 4 to 5 years. So it doesn't mean that you won't get any dementia if you're sort of predestined to get it, but it might sort of postpone it for some years because you've sort of kept your brain active. And because of your regular switching between different languages, this might take your brain some effort. So you sort of keep it in good shape. So also, not just theoretically, but also practically, this might be an interesting topic to study if you want to learn something about language and communication. Right, so we know that bilinguals often switch between languages, right? So that's sort of what makes them a bilingual. If they would only be using the same language throughout their life, so if they wouldn't be switching, then they would be monolinguals. And they sometimes do this even within sentences. So you may sometimes overhear this when you're sitting on the train. So all of a sudden in the middle of a sentence, someone switches from one language to the other. Perhaps because one concept that they want to talk about is more easily expressible in one language and not in the other. If I want to speak about something super Dutch, typically Dutch, like what have you, bitterballen or Elfstedentocht, you see I'm switching to Dutch, right? Within my sentence, switching from one language to the other. But of course, also bilinguals often switch languages between speakers. So you might be talking to one person, to your friend in one language, and then you might be talking to a colleague, for instance, in a different language. That's also a language switch, right? So you switch from one language to the other. Now, again, a very fundamental research question is, how do bilinguals select the right language to speak? So now I have certain thoughts in my head that I can express in English, but I can also express them in Dutch. And perhaps I can also express them in French or in Mandarin Chinese. So how do I make sure that I keep speaking English at this moment such that you continue to understand me? If I start expressing my thoughts all of a sudden in French, probably half of you have no clue what I'm talking about, right? So how do bilinguals select the right language to speak with? In other words, if you want to put it in a more scientific terms, perhaps, what are the control mechanisms involved in bilingual language production? There must be some kind of control mechanism in your brain that sort of makes sure that you keep speaking one language and not the other. Well, those questions, of course, have been answered already before. And a typical paradigm looks like this. So for instance, the researchers would get, in this case, 16 bilinguals into the lab. They would be unbalanced, meaning that they have one native language in which they are very proficient, and they have a second language in which they are perhaps less proficient, but still they can sort of express themselves nicely in that language as well. And then those researchers typically try to think of a task that those participants in the lab can carry out such that they can measure something to answer this question. For instance, one task you could come up with in this case is you get your bilinguals to the lab and you ask them one at a time to name certain numerals, so digits or perhaps pictures, in their first language, their L1, or in the second language, their L2, depending on the color of a certain cue, like a rectangle, a flag, or a background color. For instance, could look like this. They are sitting in front of a computer screen. You show them a certain digit, a certain numeral on the screen, and you ask them to produce the word for this numeral in their first language if there's a blue color cue around it. So if your native language is English, here you would say 4. Well, the next trial pops up, again a blue rectangle. So again, this means your native language English. So you name this digit again in your native language English. So you would say 9. But you also know that if there's a yellow Q, you name the digit in your second language. And if your second language is Dutch, you would produce the Dutch word for 5. And then again, that could be another trial where again the color is blue. So what you then get is things like there's no switches between language. There are switches from the first language to the second language. There are also switches from the second language back to the first language. And of course, there would also be no switches in the second language. So it's a very clear 2x2 design. Either you switch or you don't. And either you're speaking your first language on a trial or in your second language. And then what you can do as a researcher is measure how long it takes people to come up with a word for those numerals. So you give them a little microphone and you really very precisely measure how long it takes to produce words either in the first language or in the second language, and how long it takes to switch from one language to the other or to not switch from one language to the other. I've also been carrying out those kind of experiments myself quite a bit. Also with Dutch-English bilinguals, so native speakers of Dutch who are quite proficient in English as well. And in my case, I didn't present them with numerals, but I presented them with pictures to make it a bit more natural. And then I also measured in those kind of 2x2 designs, how long does it take those bilinguals to name those pictures in the different conditions? So it could look a bit like this. So imagine you're sitting in front of a computer screen and this is what you see, a fixation cross to fixate your eyes there. A picture then comes up. Again, there's this sort of blue, greenish, grayish color, which means name it in your first language in this case. If your first language here is Dutch, you would come up with a Dutch word for this picture. So in this case, you would say aardbei, Dutch word for strawberry. Again, that will be recorded. A fixation cross. Next trial, there's this pink color, and pink, you know, pink stands for my second language. If your second language is English, in this case, you would say chair. And again, this was a switch, right, from L1 to L2, from the first to the second language, but you would also have switches the other way around, or you would have no switches, naming pictures in the same language twice in a row in your first or your second language. And then you can very nicely get graphs like this. So here you see the picture naming reaction times. How long does it take people to come up with a name for this picture? So a picture appears. How long does it take until they start mentioning the word for this picture? And in those kind of experiments, there are typically two main findings. One is that switching languages comes at a cost. So it takes a bit longer to switch languages. And this makes a lot of sense, right? So typically always when you have to switch between different tasks, this takes a bit longer than when you have to continuously do the same task. So you can think of this even as playing tennis, right? If you're constantly hitting a forehand, that's sort of easy. If you then have to switch all of a sudden to your backhand, that sort of takes you a bit longer than you would sort of hit a forehand all the time in a row. So also here, switching languages, switching from Dutch to English, in this case, or from English to Dutch, it takes a bit longer than just continuously talking in the same language, 2 trials in a row. But what's also very interesting here is that, remember, those bilinguals were unbalanced. So Dutch was their native language, and English was their second language, and they were way more proficient in Dutch than they are in English. But still, if you look at this graph shows that they are actually slower in their native language. They're slower in their native, more proficient language, Dutch, on the right, than they are in their second language, English, on the left. And this is sort of counterintuitive, right? This is very surprising. So you would say Dutch is their native language, so they're very good at speaking Dutch. So this should be faster to them, right? Why are they all of a sudden faster in English than in Dutch? Well, and based on those kind of findings, theories are being built. So one theory we have is that it is apparently possible to sort of switch off your language a little bit. So if you're sort of, you're sort of in this situation where you have to speak in your first language and in your second language, and you also know you're less proficient in your second language, then you can sort of inhibit or deactivate your first language a little bit, such that by consequence, you become a bit faster in your second language, English, because you know that language is a bit harder to you. And of your native language, Dutch, you're more like, well, I can name those pictures in Dutch anyway, so I can sort of inhibit my Dutch a bit. So you actually become faster because you're suppressing your Dutch a bit in English. Right, so very counterintuitive finding leading to very interesting, I think, theoretical consequences. But still, then people come up, other researchers say things like, well, but this language switching in the lab, it doesn't really reflect everyday intentional language switching, right? In their everyday life. Those bilinguals are not naming pictures using single words in different trials. This is very artificial, right? The switch cues that people use, like those rectangles or those colors, sometimes people use flags. They're very artificial cues, right? If you see a blue color in everyday life, you're not all of a sudden going to switch languages, right? Doesn't make sense. So language switching in everyday life is not induced by artificial cues. It's actually induced perhaps by meeting someone who speaks that other language. So perhaps this cue-induced switch cost might not have anything to do with everyday language switching. So also the theories that we're now building based on those findings, are they so relevant for everyday situations? This is such an artificial situation. Maybe they tell you only what people can do in the lab. They don't tell you anything about how people behave, what kind of processes are going on in their mind in everyday life. Well, those are very valid criticisms. So then also nicely, we can start using VR to create more natural situations and still have participants, bilinguals, switch between their languages. So one experiment we have been building is, again, we place participants in this cave environment. So those were, again, Dutch English bilinguals. And in this case, they wouldn't be waiters or waitresses in a virtual restaurant, but they would be shopkeepers in a virtual market that you see here. If you're wearing those shutter glasses, you see everything that you now see in 2D. This would really come towards you. You experience this in 3D. And then there would be people at this market coming towards you as a shopkeeper, as a bilingual shopkeeper. And some of them, they only speak English, they only understand English, and others only understand or speak Dutch. So if this guy comes towards you with a pineapple, and he asks you, what's the price of this pineapple? He only speaks English, then you would reply to him in English, saying something like, well, this pineapple costs 90 cents. But there are also different virtual agents who come towards you with objects asking for their price. And to those virtual agents, you will respond in Dutch because they only speak Dutch. Before the experiment, you have met all of them. Some only understand English, some only understand Dutch. And in this case, sort of also in those more natural situations, we can have bilingual switch from one language to the other. Or we can have them not switch from one language to the other, speaking the same language twice in a row. In full sentences, the sentences they produce are intentional, they're communicative, very different, right, from just naming individual pictures and individual words in the lab for nobody. And again, we can measure how long it takes them to switch languages or to continue to talk in the same language. And if we then find the same pattern of results, we can be more sure that our theories generalize to those kind of richer situations in the everyday life of a bilingual. Right, so this experiment is ongoing, so we don't have the results yet, but we will find out. So that's very exciting.